Okay, good morning, everyone. Just while people are logging on, just making sure that you can hear me okay. Great. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to today, which is the final day of the roundtable for the Burra Creek project. Today, we'll be hearing from two of our community-based submitters, Ms. Mackay and Ms. Thornton. And then we'll be hearing the sort of closing submissions from the proponent. We had just one preliminary matter for you, Mr. Forrester, before we go to our community-based submitters. And that's a question in relation to document B51, which was the updated contour and LiDAR mapping. And I'm going to hand over to Member Brisger to put that question.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Forrester. Yeah, my question is in regard to some of the maps they have under or over the shading, there's a dappled effect. So, for example, on page 3 of 10, which is map 2, on the floodplain, there's a clear dappling. I'm just trying to understand whether that's some sort of base map showing through or whether that's variations and levels on the LiDAR reflecting the sort of an incomplete cleanup of vegetation cover.
Thank you. I'll seek instructions on that. It's a dappling, which is, perhaps I'll, before I jump to that, just confirm with you that we're talking about the dappling in this sort of area.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Look, it's certainly visible on the LiDAR maps without the overlay of the shading. And so I understand it's from there. As to what it represents in terms of topography or vegetation, I'll see if I can have instructions by the time I come back to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other preliminary matters that anyone wanted to raise before we start with submissions today? No? Okay, we've had notification that Ms. Mackay might be going first this morning. So are you with us, Ms. Mackay? If so, can you turn your camera on? Hello?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Great.
Can you hear me well?
We can hear you well. Now, we've received some images and videos that we understand you'll be taking us through this morning. Are you able to screen share those?
Yes, I am. I was just going to ask, I did submit a PowerPoint previously and ask if is that Rachel could share that. I won't speak to every slide, but there are a couple of key.
Us through your presentation.
So is that possible for it to be put on the screen and I just say when I want to move? Rachel was going to try to do that. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. So I did submit this previously, and there's just some important points I'd like to speak to about it. And what the way I've described the projects is there a brutalist management plan for a sensitive system, and they're unnecessary and likely to make a bad situation worse. This whole region had very quite good flows at seasonally appropriate time, right up until 96 was probably the last very good, and then 2000. After that, with gaps of 5 years between floods, the whole environment has deteriorated, particularly during the almost 15-year period during the millennium drought. But constraints are a confected management system. We had good flows above the constraints level on a regular basis, and I will show that. And why would we introduce some very, very costly, expensive and extraordinarily risky engineering projects to such a large interconnected river system in this as put way back in the time. Is that, Rachel, are you able to move on to the next slide? Thank you. So that the risks are, catastrophic hypoxic water, because we had regular flows into the closer floodplain on a regular basis, as in almost yearly prior to 96 in this region. It's the lack of seasonal flows that is causing the blackwater events that have occurred with every large flood since 2011. Thank you. We can change slides now. What will happen if we continue to operate the river in this way? The projects only cover a very small percentage of the general floodplain, 14,000 hectares compared to 375,000 hectares, which can be watered by appropriate high river levels. If we continue, we will have drying off of the floodplain, which we have had, deaths of huge water-based ecosystems, and also very large and important old growth red gum trees. Can we change now, please? This is just some visual examples of the floodplain in this region prior to the floods of small flood in this region of 2021 and the good flood last year. But the dead fish occurred in the flood last year on a system-wide basis, but particularly in this region, even as far as Kangaroo Lake, enormous Murray cod died. This was not due to the flood, it was due to the lack of floods in the year, smaller floods in the years previous. We need higher rivers going onto our floodplain in order to flush out all the organic matter on a regular basis and rejuvenate the system and stop that incredible breakdown occurring. When it's irregular, it causes hypoxic water and is an ecologically devastating event and can be managed not to occur. Can we change the slide, please? One of the big concerns and problems with these projects is that they do not give us any guarantee of flows into the general floodplain. That did occur until a recent basis. And what we're very likely to end up with is lake or dam-like areas that are flooded by pumping or occasional high rivers. And I've showed those areas in this region in the green, and all the other areas are the places that will be neglected. If flood regimens continue as they have done in the last 20 years, and if the enormous expansion of horticulture means that water is not reserved for the environment, what we'll end up with is a disconnected system of I can't say what sort of health they'll be at the site, but in general, they'll be disconnected, and that is not the way to end up with a sustainable Murray River ecosystem. In fact, it's going to be quite laughable in terms of ecological correct management. Thank you. Next slide. Toxic water. This is a huge Murray cod that died in vinifera forest last year. These sort of events, blackwater events and algae, system-wide algae events, or even in this region prior to 2011. And on the MDBA website, there's a study about it, which says that they never occurred on a system-wide basis. So we really need to be looking at how to manage the flows of our rivers to create healthy water and healthy ecosystems across the system. It's just impossible to continue doing it the way we have been for the last 20 years, which is flooding small areas, denying higher rivers that reach into the floodplain in this region. And this is what we'll end up with, where really nothing's any good. Please change slides. The big question we could be asking and really studying is, have the previous Living Murray projects been a success? That would be our best guide. They have not. They've been more successful or gotten some big outcomes in years when there's been a natural flood. This is very telling. The water plants have deteriorated in all areas. there's not the proof there that they're beneficial. They have had the same risks of black water and stagnation and algae as other places. We've also had in the last year, because we do not know the impact of changing the flow regimen in there and we've had still black water coming through those sites because we've really altered them so much. We cannot take the same risks with these extra sites, and we don't really have proof of effectiveness or good management in the ones that have already been done. There is also currently a lot of talk that the alteration by the massive channel in Kundra Paracuda has caused higher flows to go out to the Warkul during the floods. This could be, in fact, reducing the flows into this part of the system. So have we, in fact, done some engineering works that have actually stopped flows into this area already by the massive engineering works that have been done upstream? So these are all the questions that must be answered before we have giving permission to further massive engineering projects. I'd just like to say, where on earth, where in this nation, in another intact natural system, would you ever be able to do such enormous constructive works? People struggle to, or businesses or national parks struggle to have a cafe or a tourist information centre built within a national park or at an entrance. And here we are going to alter a whole complex system of interconnected floodplains. Please change the slide. There, I've just got some links there to discussions about fish kills. I've talked about them and we've talked enough. What I will say is that last year they had to use a large amount of environmental water to flush out black water. So we weren't even using it in a preemptive beneficial way. We were doing it to repair the problems of our current management. Just change slides again, please. Thank you so much. There are other issues that are happening in this region due to the way that rivers manage in a very unseasonal way. So what we should be aiming for is a higher river in late winter and spring, and a lower river in summer if it can be managed. But what is interesting is happening in this region. We used to have a huge amount of sandbars where people would swim and congregate, enjoy. They are getting flushed away and disappearing due to the lack of flow variation. And the banks of the Murray are collapsing at higher rates than ever before, as not due to the flood last year, but in general, on a dry bank, the river is running past very quickly to supply downstream irrigation, and there are other impacts. Just change slide, please. As I've said previously, the Victorian government really has the cart before the horse, attempting to progress these engineered solutions before relaxing constraints. Thank you. Please change slides. So the premise that these projects are founded on is that these floodplains have been deprived of water due to river regulation is untrue. It's not the river regulation over the last 100 years. Marketisation of water has caused a huge uptake of licences that weren't used. So prior to marketisation in the mid-90s, this floodplain, we had a naturally seasonally high river, and the basin plan and high river in late winter and spring used allocation better and other factors. The floodplain is a photograph in Nyah Vinifera boundary band, which I'm familiar with, was full of water plants and in good health. It might have been shorter than the optimal amount, but it still had great diversity. It flushed, it bred fish, crayfish. It was incredible. Change slides, please. But the institution of this, a confected fallacy about, needing to run the river at lower levels, that is what has just deprived the floodplain of water in the last 25 years. It has been the way the river's operated and the way, any sort of compensation or improved assistance for people who have some floodplain land that used to always get water on it has not been progressed, but the lack of appropriate flows is causing environmental devastation. If there's more detail there, can you please change slides? What is happening? Well, more photos to show. This is the death that's happening in the Red Gum floodplain between Swan Hill and Robinvale. But when we have had blackwater events, in 2011, 80% of the crayfish in this region died by research that's done since. And in the last flood that we've just had, there were far fewer crayfish coming up out of the water because they're a whole lots of lake systems where fish would normally breed have been deprived of water. Thank goodness last year and this year they've had water. But I've just got some graphs showing that prior to the mid-90s, we had flows. In the next slide, please. Flows at Turrumbary, we've got the slide to show prior to the mid-90s, we had flows of over 30,000 megalitres and up to 40, reasonably often 50 on a very regular basis, which is enough to get water into all of these areas. Or many of these areas, maybe not the more distant black box, but it's a complex system. Next slide, please. I've just done more to explain that, talking about the gauge at Euston. And next slide again, anyone can look at those if they would like to. That's from the witnessing information from the previous. Next slide, please. So we have another slide showing flows at Swan Hill, which were very regularly up to 25,000 megalitres prior to the up to the mid-90s, and with the larger floods since. So, but in these drier periods, we're operating the river at below 15,000 and it can't get into the floodplain. Can you please change slides again? I've just got a lot of photographs to show. Okay, look, I had a video and I think I've got it in my next slide. Maybe I can show it, but it doesn't take really enormous floods that we had last year to get water into many of the deep billabongs, most of them, in fact, I would say. Once we get to over 29,000 at Boundary Bend, we get an inundation of a large amount of the floodplain. It's incredible. And that happened in 2021, 2022, and happening again now. Can we change the slide, please? So I guess what I'm trying to show here, this is the large billabong at Boundary Bend. It's enormous. It's been denied water for dozens of years in the past 25, but just showing flows at Robinvale, Euston Gauge, which regularly went up to 50,000 litres a day before the mid-90s. Just change slides again, please. It's also very much helped. We've had some great circumstances in this year, but we can avoid flooding people upstream by good use of the tributaries. And here's a beautiful flow from the Murrumbidgee. So we knew the Murrumbidgee would be in flow and, well, not in severe flood, but have at least decent flows. In 2020, megalitres from the Murrumbidgee on a reasonably, not very high Murray, inundated those floodplains downstream. This is a beautiful picture of the water coming in from the Murrumbidgee. Can you change slides? Yeah, so the big problem with these projects is it's measuring improvement, and it's saying that they're going to do a lot of improvement, but they're measuring off the very lowest base, which is after the millennium drought and with constraints restricting flows in the last 20 years, which, as I've said, are a sort of management system. Naturally, the river flowed at those heights well above constraint levels, very often prior to the mid-90s. So in a way, it's failure to act, part of the poor outcome of the basin devastation. And now the proponents are able to say that these projects are going to improve something, but in fact, it's management that's been depriving this area of water. And spoken about in this project, so I'll just go into that. There are a lot of other, potentially a lot of impacts from the last flood around boundary broke, and we had all flows change. So I suspect that it's time to really spend time and go back and look at all of that, whatever's happened in the last flood, and not definitely not be trying to push these projects through where some of them may not even be necessary. And with reducing blockages, we might be able to get a lot better flows into some areas than we realise. Change slide, please. So the region was once resplendent with wildlife, but and it's not that long ago. It just shows what a sensitive system it is, that it's been so devastated in the last 20 years. Change slides, please. So if we enable flows to get into the greater floodplain, countless communities will be happy as they have lakes near them that will be full of water and breed wonderful yabbies and golden perch. This is a picture of Lake Puma, one of the lake systems between the Murray and Walcool that has been denied water over the past 20 years due to constraints on the river operating just below the level required to get into the creek. A whole lake system dry, 5 or 6 interconnected lakes. This year it bred golden perch. This is a man of over 80 years old, sitting in the back of his ute, absolutely ecstatic to see water back in the lake. So there's many, many benefits, from water quality to recreation to tourism and just plain old quality of life. Or as this man said, having my grandchildren being able to enjoy the finer things of life, which we live in a basically without good flows into the floodplain, we live in almost a desert with a channel running through it, and it could be so much more than that. Change slides, please. Here are a lot of examples of how the current management system works with blocking up creeks and pumping water into sites. It's just diabolically, mind-bogglingly idiotic. Thank you. Please change slides. So this region was the most free flowing part of the Murray. There are no weirs or locks between Turrumbry and Robinvale. We have the Loddon coming in, the Walcool and the Murrumbidgee. It's a divine system. If we want to be sort of, if I want to be a marketer, it's Kakadu without the crocodiles, and we're about to lose it if we continue trying to manage this system in this way. Change slides, please. Thank you. Why? Because it's worth it. The results will be phenomenal. We're a smart country. This is the Walcool Junction. We flew over it in a plane to, that's from a plane trying to see that. This is when I'm talking about Kakadu without the crocodiles. This is the sort of scale we're looking at. Look at the beauty, the animals, the enjoyment people will have. We should be a smart country that can have an incredible horticulture system and manage our waterways to be as healthy and beautiful as they can be. We're surely a country that is smart enough to do that. Next slide, please.
That is the end of the slides.
Oh, I thought there was just one more. Can we just go back one? Oh, why should we do it? I think what we should be doing here is working on, these are what I think we should be doing. Treat the red gum parks as a general asset, employ hundreds of rangers to manage the parks with an emphasis on employments of First Nations people, use First Nations expertise to co-design and manage the areas, protecting the living cultural and environmental heritage for future generations, reassess the modelling in light of the 22 flood, work on the constraints project. Number 1, get flows at a seasonally appropriate time, honour the basin plan and recover the right amount of water. But whilst that's happening, do the best we can with the consumptive water. When we do the constraints, we can put environmental water on top of consumptive water, monitor the improvements and repeat the good flows 3 years out of 5. After about 5 years of good flows, carefully consider if any modest engineering can improve on nature. Unlikely, but no harm in checking, and redeploy all the good people, all the very good people working on these projects to genuine environmental work. They'll be much happier and we'll be able to measure all of the wonderful results that will follow the implementation of the above plan. that's the end of that. But what I would like to do is share some photos. I went on a road trip on this Saturday. We're often told that it's not possible to achieve inundation of the floodplain with flows. And right at the moment, we're having a sort of a natural or managed flood event. It's a combination of both, as releases from Hume Dam and other places are causing what we would have considered to be in previous years just a normal. Can we show me again just for a second? We can take the presentation away. In the past years, we would have considered the higher river we're having now, that has been up to about 25,000 megalitres a day at Swan Hill, and it's, I think, up into the 50s at Robinvale, with the Warkul and Murrumbidgee contributing. That's been going on for about a month, and so I did a drive up to Balsa Island and took photographs along the way. I just wanted to share that to show the people on the committee and others what is happening at the moment, so that it is in fact achievable. Not vain, but just wanting to show that I was there. So the first picture I'll show is just, can you see those pictures that I've got up there?
Not yet.
Oh, here we go. We've got one picture. This is just a variety of places that I went to. Sorry, I don't know why it's
We can see that now. If you could just, it's a bit small, so it's a bit hard to read. If you could just locate the Burra Creek project.
Sure. The Burra Creek one is the one that says here at Goodnight, and that's
Yes.
a photograph of the Burra Creek.
Yep.
I'm just going to stop sharing. Look, we did practice this just before, so I'm just going to try again.
It's all right. Take your time. It's, you know, you practice and then it goes wrong.
Yeah, I know. Okay, so all right, I'll just try the adding, and maybe I can just do it one as a group. So I'm going to give that a shot.
Mm-hmm.
Just bear with me. I really appreciate it, and
No
I'm
problem.
sorry. I'm still working at it. I won't be long.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, we'll give that a, let's see. It seems to be doing something. So on my journey, we've had flows that we would have considered to be a normal high river in winter, what older people call just a lovely flush down the river system. And it's caused, we've had amazing, beautiful flows into the floodplain between Swan Hill and Balsa Island or near Robinvale, but I'm presuming there's also flows upstream and further downstream. So what's going on is that currently it's proving that we can have these sort of flows. So this is me on a boat about the early August in VMFRP forest.
Like we may have a glitch there. We've got a temporary freeze. Just have to pause for a second to see if Ms. McKay can back online. Rachel, you might just want to pause the recording because this might take a moment. That's all right. We can hear you. We just can't see you.
Oh, okay. Now we can see me.
Yep.
I'm not really sure. I might try sharing my screen a different way and show some photos, if
Sure.
that's okay. It seems to be only wanting to show one or two. Oh, well, I'll show a photo from Burra Creek.
Okay.
I might have to show them a couple at a time. So that previous photo was in VMFRP. So that's more close to Swan Hill. This is Burra Creek presently. This high river, I'll do another one. I'll just do some one by one and you can tell me when we've run out of time. So I will go, this is VMFRP on Saturday. So looking absolutely fabulous. These large red gum trees, this area of the forest was flooded almost on a yearly basis, really, when I was younger. These large trees have almost been dying, but thank goodness the last 2 years they've had water. But what we have seen is due to deprivation of the last 25 years, the water plants that were there before, it was resplendent with complex water flora, have not returned. So we've already caused huge devastation in addition to killing 80% of the crayfish. However, we can save these landscapes, and it's not by huge engineering projects and disconnected flows. What we need is water that flows in through the creeks from the rivers. So that was VMFRP there. And what I'd like to show you at the same time is here is to show you how this river system, what happens when we have a high river. This river is within its bank. So this is at Naya. And at the same time, the floodplain, the creeks are what fills up the floodplain first. Eventually the river goes over the banks, but these flows are fabulous, still really quite high. And the river is well within its banks. That's a lovely high river at Naya, but just upstream, the VMFRP forest is full to the furthest Billabong. So the next area along.
If you've got any photos of Burra Creek, they're going to be the most useful to this committee.
I understand. Here's another photo of Burra Creek. So that's from Saturday. I guess what I would say is, yes, they're useful, but it's very instructive to show that the whole of the floodplain at the moment is getting flows. So this project is focused on Burra Creek, but it's part of a system of other projects that affect all of these areas. And what we have happening now is the solution, which is a river that's flowing at about 20 to 25,000 megalitres at Swan Hill, 30,000 to 45, 50 is fantastic between Boundary Bend and Robinvale. And we can achieve, this can all be achieved by having seasonally appropriate flows, which is after all the point of the basin plan. So all these dead trees are dead because of restricted river flows, not because these trees died. They were alive prior to the mid-90s, and they've been killed by reducing the river flows to below the level that goes into creeks. So that's Burra Creek. I've got more.
I mean, you've obviously got a lot of local knowledge about what's happening up on the floodplain. Do you know if, you won't know for every tree, obviously, but just as generally, was there a lot of tree death of those larger trees during the Millennium Drought? It's happened worse and more since then. Right.
So they certainly, that was the longest period, I believe, that they would have ever gone without water. However, it's just continued on. So some of the photos that I showed in my previous presentation, they're all trees that have died since.
Okay.
So when I talk about the impacts of us flooding these small areas, the reason I show those trees is that's what will happen in the other areas, and it will continue to happen. So we're talking about environmental and cultural devastation on a massive scale that's being proposed. And that's, I'll going to find a photo of, we can find, I can send a presentation with 20 old growth dead trees from vinifera forest or Naya forest that weren't dead after the millennium drought that have died since. But it's probably of huge concern that the flora, the aquatic flora that was present in incredible beauty and complexity is no longer there. It just has not been able to survive these 5 years each of dryness, because these are what we're doing is we're depriving waterways of water. And I think it's entirely possible that the hypoxic event of 2011 killed the plants, or that is it the 5 years without water, the 10 years without water. But getting it back.
To sort of play devil's advocate role here, that the proponent is saying, well, let's try and bring some of the water back to some of these floodplains. So, I mean, you're obviously opposing the projects. The projects are aiming to bring more water back to the...
Yes.
So, why oppose the projects?
Absolutely. Sure. I'd love to explain that. The reason is that this area was environmentally intact 25 years ago. So the projects are based on a false premise that it's the dam building of 100 years ago that caused the deprivation. No, they were intact. The remedy is management of the river heights, which can be achieved, and it will be actually sustainable and environmentally functional. These projects, for one thing, they're altering the whole hydrology and topography of the area. They're disturbing sites of enormous cultural importance, but environmental importance. We already have some evidence that the other engineered sites have done damage, and they certainly have not had any caused environmental integrity. What I've shown you, the photos, the graphs I've shown you, that's the system with environmental integrity. You need to have connected flows from the river system. These projects are not giving us any guarantee that they won't just sit a pump on a bit of cement, and they've all got pump sites attached to them, and pump water in. Now, fish can't go into a pump. Small-bodied fish, well, it's just ludicrous, to be honest, to say that that's going to be anything like what we're about to lose if we take this path. So the sensible pathway would be to repeat these, use our river tributaries, they're not mine, the river tributaries of the Murrumbidgee and the Warkul and the Loddon and the Murray together to cause a high river at the right time. The water's not lost to irrigation. It flows into the floodplain and then it flows back out again. It doesn't have the same risks. We never had, I guess what the projects are doing basically continue on the same as we've been doing for the last 25 years, which is denying the floodplain water because they call it wasted, pumping into certain sites. And what we've had is 3 systemic blackwater events and increases in cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, which is toxic to fish, animals and plants, very likely causes motor neuron disease, shouldn't be put on edible plants. And the blackwater we've killed 80% of the crayfish in this region. So that's why I say the projects are being proposed as a solution that is a very poor solution with likely to have very bad outcomes. Another problem of it is it has so many decision points to operate it properly. So even in this, so when you have so many regulators to open and close, so many blockages to remove and open, it requires so much decision making. It's highly unlikely that those things will be done properly or well. And we have plenty of evidence. Even this year, when the river became high, the regulator that lets water into the Poon Boon Lake system was not open the river was high enough for about 6 weeks. It's only been open for about the last 3 weeks because the system all the floods that's going into these areas right now is a system operating itself in a way. But here we are proposing until, you know, the end of time to employ how many thousands of people to make these decisions and walk around opening and closing regulators, but also operating pumps, when we can do that by letting the river flow at 25,000 megalitres at Turrumbry, 10,000 at, and it's not so complicated as that. It's that, and that system will grow fish, plants, animals, and it'll be ecologically sustainable. Whereas this is, most local people are absolutely horrified. They've seen water pumped. We've seen stagnant water. We've seen algae become endemic in various places because the river waters have to flow. You know, you have to have flow and connection. Fish can't survive. And we all know with ecology, you take out any parts, it becomes out of balance and dysfunctional. So that's what we have here. There is no evidence of systemic blackwater events prior to 2011. Now we can achieve, if we do achieve this, and for one thing, get the constraints lifted, then we'll be able to operate the river without causing, the river will be able to flow without causing flooding or problems on private land. And because this area here is, we thought this was what the basin plan was for. When water was marketised, we stopped having the flows that we'd had, and we thought this is what the basin plan is going to help this area just get what it had before, which was a natural sort of flow regime, not natural back to pre-white people, but natural back to the 80s, 70s, 60s. So we could have flows into lakes and creeks. It's going to be environmentally devastating to continue on this way. And the real...
I've just got to jump in there. I'm very mindful of the time. We've sort of gone over a fair bit already. I've just got a couple of questions for you, and member Brisbane may also have some questions. So if it's all right with you, we might just go to those.
That's great.
So on slide 3, you said that I think you were citing the Fenner School submission here, that we could water 375,000 hectares versus choosing to water 14,000 hectares. Can you just explain where those figures come from? What the 375,000 represents and how you would do that, and why the 14,000 is a sort of an alternative to the 375,000?
I think I got it from the submission from the previous, the NIA VMFRP. That
was from the Fenner School submission.
But even just looking at the map that I've shown in this area, the area of floodplain is huge and the projects are small. So going on what we've had in the past, told to us, you know, what we've seen is that there's been no commitment from the catchment management authorities, the water authorities, the Department of Environment to actually getting good flows. So what they've done is have pumped water into small areas to as an emergency sort of measure.
And so are you saying these projects, to the extent that they stop people's real problem,
yes,
they shouldn't go ahead?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And also they have their own risks to water quality. And we're doing huge engineering work. It's natural land, that some of it is national park, some of it is, well, it's all highly valuable for the river system itself, for the people who live on it, for First Nations people, for all those benefits it brings to its natural qualities in itself that we value, you know, nature for.
Yeah. And
it's the most important river system, the largest and most significant river system. It's where we have the confluence of all the rivers. It's sort of, you know, this is the mighty Murray. Why would we do this to it?
You also mentioned in your presentation that, you know, a number of other areas sort of further downstream from Burra Creek, like Boundary Bend, will decline. is it that the projects themselves will result in a direct decline of those areas, or is it that the project, like we talked about before, the projects are really diverting attention away from the main problem, and the decline of things like Boundary Bend is a result of the way the whole Murray-Darling Basin is being managed at the moment, rather than as a direct result of these projects?
Well, we don't have any commitment from the Victorian government to lifting the constraints and operating a seasonally high river. Now, that should be the first priority. When we don't have that, we know from previous experience that an area like this will be prioritised, and there's no commitment to having a seasonally appropriate flow that will get water into the creeks and lakes of the other areas, which are the vastly larger area. So as we've seen in the past 25 years, they have declined from lack of flows, deteriorated markedly, shockingly. It's it shouldn't have, I mean, it should be that the government can be sued for denying water to a place that requires water. That's what it has happened. It should be not able to happen, but it has happened. Lakes,
but it's happening as a result of constraints and, you know, diversion for irrigation and those other sort of broader system-wide issues.
Yeah, but constraints were not a thing prior to the mid-90s. They're a perverse outcome of the Basin Plan, a recognition of constraints, because environmental flows is seen as a managed flow. So it's only dam spills that are seen as okay to, you can't sue the government. So it would be hard to explain to anyone. It makes no logical sense that we're not allowing the river to flow at a height that's it did before. As I've shown by those graphs, it frequently did. It's not 80 years ago. It's in the mid-90s. It was flowing like that all the time. It's a result of this terribly complex negotiation of the Basin Plan. But will these sites have an impact? I would argue that it's really highly likely that the management of Kundruk, Paracuda and Barmah has not been good for water quality within their site or without, and that there have been impacts of black water. That's recognised in 2016, that huge amounts of black water flowed through some engineering projects. I think it's Kundruk, Paracuda, it could be Barmah, I'm not 100%, but this is in the research, it's on the MDBA website, because they are completely altered areas, and that there were huge cod deaths in the Warkall River after that. And I think that's a known thing. So, of course, there's risks. When you alter water quality to such an extent, when you don't have a commitment to flow, you get the problems of stagnation. And that's recognised in the fish management plans of these projects. It said that there was a risk of black water, there was a risk of cyanobacteria, because when we're talking about pumped water, this is stagnant water. Now, it's pretty hard.
I'm just gonna pause you there.
Yes.
I'm going to just check in with member Brisker as to whether she's got any further questions for you, because we're sort of out of time and we need to allow Ms. Thornton to give her presentation as well.
Sure.
I just have one question, and that's that you had a photograph, I think it was the second last slide, an aerial shot of the Warkall Junction in flood. I'm just interested in when that photograph was taken.
Oh, well, when? Sorry. Oh, January this year. So as the flood was subsiding. But I have numerous photographs that I'd like to upload from my trip on Saturday, because you can see the floodplain resplendent, but once every 5 or 10 years is just not enough, as we've seen by the Blackwater events. We're going to have, it's only from between 2022 and 2016, I think that was the last flood. So that's 6 years, and yet we still had a devastating Blackwater event. We need to get regular seasonal flows into these areas to prevent the toxic effects of blackwater, and when there's low rivers, the toxic effects of cyanobacteria. The Basin Plan was really started in relation to a massive blue-green algae outbreak on the Darling River that really put the nation into a state of emergency, and instead of causing the effective response to that, our management has become worse and worse and worse, and water quality has deteriorated on a grand scale.
Oh, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for, I really appreciate the chance to make my submission.
Thanks for coming along, and thanks for your input into the process. If you got them on the email, but if you could upload those images into the Google Drive just so other parties have access to them as well.
Yes, yeah. We're experiencing currently an absolutely amazing and wonderful environmental flow, and huge areas are coming to life. Thank you.
We saw that on our site visit.
Yeah, unfortunately it would have been
last
sad
week.
because there are many areas where you can't see, you can't know how to access the floodplain.
Yeah.
So I hope you enjoy my slideshow.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Okay. Okay, is Ms. Thornton online? If so, you could turn your camera on, please. Hiya, Ms. Thornton. You've just got to unmute.
I'm not sure why my camera's looking very blurry.
It is looking a bit blurry, but we can see you and we can hear you clearly, which is the most important thing. Oh,
That's
that's
a little
better.
bit better.
Yeah. Okay, we'll hand over to you.
Okay. So obviously our ability to, or my ability to present here today is based on my original submission for the Nile VMFRP and Borough. Okay, and whilst the committee has changed a little bit, hasn't it? The membership of the committee, I'll make an assumption that my submission has been read.
That is a correct assumption.
Well, I just don't look. I don't know how valuable it is to be rereading, or I also made an additional submission which I had intended to read out at the end of the last roundtable for Nile and VMFRP. You know, I don't want to go over old ground. A lot of what I had presented was probably out of the scope, because a lot of what I am concerned about is the broader picture that, or the broader framework, I suppose, that these projects sit within. And Nicole and other people from my community around Swan Hill, we've worked together, learning about these projects, engaging in the basin plan. And so a lot of what I have to say is along similar lines and in agreement with Nicole's submission, which I've been able to sit in here and listen to. Obviously, I'd had a look at the submission, her submission, which was uploaded prior to the last. So look, I'll make some brief comments and then I'll just offer any, I'm available for any questions, I suppose. I am really intrigued with what the current or the recent negotiations on the basin plan mean, because from my point of view, they seem to, well, it's unclear, I suppose, how the ongoing negotiations will impact what happens with these projects, and also with the constraints relaxation projects. And so, you know, I would imagine that would have a major impact on what these projects are able to deliver. I mean, we've reduced down the scope of what the environment report is able to look at, but obviously it's heavily impacted by being a connected river system by all of the other laws, policies and management practices that work around it. So yeah, it's pretty concerning to see Victorian government saying that they're not going to participate further. I think it's the constraints relaxation projects, which are also offset projects, but to my mind would really enable us to get the water out of the dams, the recovered water out of the dams and into our region. So we contributed to that recovered water via, efficiency projects via buybacks, but our region hasn't been able to see the great benefit of much of that recovered water because of this, I'll call it the Turrumbry rule, that was an agreement that stood the test of time. It's not law, it's not legislation, it's just an agreement that governments have decided to abide by, in terms of not allowing environmental water to be used to enable higher flows. I think that the fact that we've picked and we've allowed governments to pick and choose which parts of the basin plan that we have worked on has meant that we're at a point now where we're not able to fully ascertain whether we have the right amount of environmental water recovered. Water recovery is hugely controversial in our community. And if we had been further down the track on constraints relaxation, we would be able to see the full benefit of the water that we had recovered, and therefore we would be better informed to understand whether such huge offsets were valid, and also we would have been further down the track in terms of better managing and understanding how we can use environmental water through the various options that we have, or delivery methods that we have, via irrigation systems, via natural carriers. That's been considerably stymied, I would say, because there's been a lack of action on constraints relaxation.
I mean, as you did sort of recognise a moment ago, these are issues that are outside the scope of this committee. So if you're able to kind of bring it back to the Burra Creek project context, that would be helpful.
Yeah, okay. I really don't know that I have anything absolutely specific to say on the Burra Creek. The Burra Creek already has some engineering solutions, or there are already regulators on the Burra Creek, and I understand that there is removal of some block banks that would be part of this project, which I would absolutely support. So I recognise that there are some parts of this project that may be beneficial. A lot of what I have to say is I would be very much in agreement in saying that these are endgame solutions that are being prioritised and should be left till well down the track of the basin plan. So the cart before the horse. I'll just go back to my original submission. I don't want to say anything else specifically about the Burra Creek other than what I've just said, which is that there are already regulators there, and the block banks that would be removed, I think, would be a good thing. I don't know. I really don't understand the extent to which the existing structures are being reworked, and exactly how much of an improvement that's going to be. I'll be honest in saying it's been impossible for us as volunteers, as just community people, to get across all of the documentation. And I think, again, with reducing down the scope of the environment report so much, it does. When you reduce down a scope to a point, it is very hard to argue that, on balance, a project may be able to improve something, but it's only because you've reduced it down so much that you're not able to talk about the broader impacts. I worked for a decade in vegetation restoration. native vegetation restoration, and I would say that ecological equivalence is a very much a subjective subject, and the use of offsets, whether it be in vegetation management, carbon offsets, you know, is been extremely problematic. So my additional submission focused on a lot around our current environmental laws and the review of the PBC Act, the fact that it was found to be ineffectual, and I just wanted to draw the committee's attention to that. And I thought that it was relevant that we have that front of mind, given that, you know, we're still assessing projects on a law that has been assessed to be ineffectual. So, you know, we can't keep using the same methods and expect a different outcome. I think there's a lot of opportunity, given the fact that we have very different flows with all of the new irrigation development that has happened since the Millennium Drought in the Lower Murray, and there's been a little opportunity to understand how we can use environmental water with those changed consumptive deliveries. And so we've sort of, most of these projects were designed or idealized at least before most of the water was recovered. And so I wonder whether there has been enough focus on the models of the new flows, consumptive flows. I hope that has been looked at. Look, I'm going to leave it there because I don't want to keep going over stuff that's out of scope, because you're probably not going to listen to it anyway. I don't know why. It's good to have the opportunity to be here. You know, we keep turning up. We keep, you know, I've recently submitted to the Productivity Commission review, which I've submitted to the Productivity Commission review of the Basin Plan 5 years ago. The government didn't take on the recommendations, or most of the recommendations, of the Productivity Commission review. How can we restore integrity and trust in government if independent organisations like the Productivity Commission, like Royal Commissions, aren't enacted by governments? I mean, one of the reasons why I think the current negotiations with the Basin Plan, or moving forward with the new Basin Plan, is nobody trusts, like, both sides of the I suppose the debate, could I say, sort of irrigation versus the environment, which is how it's sort of been pitched by political parties and by I've lost my train of thought there. I apologise.
That's all right.
Oh yeah, so nobody is willing. Like, if we were able to say, okay, let's put this thing on pause, nobody wants that to happen, because nobody trusts the government or the institutions to be able to actually put, you know, I guess, best foot forward for all parties. So I was very much trying to put forward the idea of, why aren't we going back to investing in sort of regional they want, rather than these projects being forced upon them, how they want their sort of floodplain areas too, because most of the community don't understand these projects.
I mean, look, you've raised, we're not saying these issues aren't important issues. They are issues, however, that we don't have scope to address. But look, one thing I did want to ask you about, I mean, you're locally based, you're obviously, you've got a long dedication to the area. We've been sort of talking throughout the course of this roundtable about the boom bust cycle, ecological cycle of floodplains in general, and these floodplains in particular. Ms. McKay sort of talked to us about how we're in the middle of a fabulous boom, and things are looking fantastic just at the moment. Is there anything you can tell us based on your sort of observations of how the area has gone over the last decade, say, in relation to that boom bust cycle, and whether you think that the Burra Creek project could improve or worsen, I guess, the ecological condition of the Burra Creek floodplain? Is there anything you wanted to say on that?
Oh, look, I mean, I don't think that the whole system, the Murray-Darling Basin, is in better health because we have a basin plan. I think that these projects, like the Burra Creek projects, tend to move us more towards an icon site mentality of managing the system, which I don't think is optimum, and I don't think it should be what we're aiming for. You know, I think we could be aiming a lot higher than that, or at least exploring the opportunities that we have, because the system's changed so much, say, in the last 10 years. We're still very much in a bust, even though we've got a little blip. We know that climate change has had a massive impact on inflows across all the rivers, and many, you know, lots of the Loddon River is one of the worst rivers in terms of climate change, or the measured inflows over the past 10 years. However, we've sort of let politics direct where this is going, rather than science, I suppose. And we've got this amazing thing called the Water Act, and I think it gives us an amazing opportunity going forward, because it does hold science up, and it does allow us to adjust as we go forward what the SDL will be. It's just disappointing that we don't listen to the democratic institutions. I don't think that we've improved this situation, and I don't think that moving to an icon site mentality allows us to improve the situation.
Okay.
Is there a place for engineering? I suppose there probably is. At some point, there is a place for engineering solutions. I just hoped that the basin plan would lock in something better. It's not written anywhere that I know of that overbank flows are seen as a higher, a better, something that we're aspiring to. Where is that written into it? It's not. It's just sort of it's disappointing that we don't have that opportunity to sort of really pursue that. We've got to just, it's all based around these projects that haven't taken into account the changes that have happened over the last 10 years, I suppose. That's all I can say.
Okay. I'll just check in with Member Brisker as to whether she has any questions for you.
No questions from me.
Okay. Thanks, Ms. Thornton. Thanks for your input into the process.
No worries.
Okay, what we might do is take our morning break now, Mr. Forrester, and we'll resume at 11:25 for Lower Murray Water's closing submission. Okay, Mr. Forrester, we have your Part C submission, which is document B50. Perhaps just before we go to that, we might go back to the question about the, if I can call this, going to be a very non-technical description of Member Briscoe's question this morning, but the dappling and the sort of lumps on the LiDAR plan. Have you got instructions on that yet?
I do. Can I say I have some trepidation about my ability to give otherwise than a bit of a non-technical response in my own language, but I'm instructed that the dappling is taken from and displayed on the basis of the VicMap elevation DEM, which is a raster representation of elevation in the area at a vertical accuracy of 5 meters or better. And on that basis and on the basis of the instructions I've received from Tetra Tech Coffee, who was responsible for the preparation of these maps, it's understood to be a representation of vegetation as distinct from indicating topography, particularly within the inundation area. The accurate depiction of topography can be found by reference to the contours rather than that dappling effect. You'll see, Member Briscoe, of course, when you look outside the inundation area in particular, what that DEM 10-metre product is doing in terms of hill shading, but it's not hills that it's shading inside the inundation area.
Thanks, I understand.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you do. My intention is to talk to that Part C submission primarily and to share with the committee some documents as I go. And the committee will have noticed on its review of the Part C submission, to the extent it's done that it's very much targeted at matters which have arisen in discussion consistent with Direction 33 made by the committee to the effect that it should direct, and in my submission today I should address only responses to material in the roundtable. At this stage, and on the basis of the submissions made and evidence adduced in this roundtable, as well as in respect of the central projects and NIRA and VMFRP, the proponent continues to rely on its position in terms of those matters relevant to all VMFRP projects. Our submissions in respect of the committee's terms of reference and reporting tasks, and the content of the environment report itself, and the addendum documents themselves in respect of the Burra Creek project. What I will do is talk to first the question of the assessment of the benefits of the project. Second, the assessment of relevant environmental effects of the projects, and they're grouped, as the committee will have seen, by theme, consistent with the theme days convened in this roundtable. And then finally make some observations in respect of the development and then the operation of the project and the proposed project controls, which are proposed to be in place should the project ultimately be approved. So talking from page 2 of table document 50 and the benefits of the project, I'll start by observing that in the specific context of this submission, focus is very much on overarching propositions of benefit. Stepping back from those predicted benefits in respect of particular species and environmental components of the floodplain environment to questions about where the VMFRP came from and what it proposes to do. From paragraph 5, some principles in respect of the floodplain restoration objectives and the concept of terrestrialisation are set out on that basis. And as extracted at paragraph 5, the first listed VMFRP project objective is to protect and restore floodplain ecosystem biodiversity values, function and habitat components, including for key species and communities, by better aligning the frequency, duration and timing of managed inundation events with the ecological needs of the floodplains, and by improving resilience to threats such as climate change. And it's that objective which then is directly connected to the balance of the VMFRP project objectives, including in respect of traditional owner aspirations and the social and economic benefits associated with healthy riverine landscapes. And in my submission, it's that project objective which really crystallises the policy response to the condition of floodplains along the Murray River and throughout the basin, and to the identified threats to their condition, both to their, what I'll call their aspirational condition, the condition that they were once in, and to their condition today. And it's that policy response which forms the basis upon which the VMFRP was conceived and developed and is now proposed. And in the context of discussion, and particularly today, as a good example this morning, there's been a question in the course of this roundtable, as there was in previous and in the central hearing, in respect of the question of why. Why protect and restore floodplain ecosystem biodiversity values and function habitat components? Why do something to endeavour to better align the frequency, duration and timing of inundation with natural circumstances? And why deign to intervene here at Burra Creek in circumstances where it's identified even in the Specialist Assessment B, the Terrestrial Ecology Specialist Assessment, that as an example of, or as a part of the Murray Fans bioregion, Burra Creek is one of the best preserved floodplain woodland and shrubland communities. Because even in the context of the 2010 to 2012 floods and the 2016 flood, and more recently, the events of the last 12 months, this floodplain is showing us that the threats to its condition, which are coming into focus, a particularly sharp focus over recent decades and which are expected to persist into the future, are being realised. And because being one of the best preserved communities as of 2014 won't count for much if those threats continue. And it's the basis of the VMFRP program that that the public policy position is not to accept that, to not look gladly upon a greening response in the months following a flood event, and hope that our climatic future will deliver to the floodplain what it needs to continue to represent its bioregion and to continue to support its relevant values. Because the identified trajectory of the floodplains, and because the future impacts of climate change in particular, mean we can have confidence that they do face threats of serious and irreversible harm if we do nothing. Consistent with the scoping requirements and findings of particularly the Minister, the basis on which the alternative to this project are properly considered is it's this project or the do nothing approach, which we stand to compare. As I've said, and as we know, it's settled public policy that we don't do nothing. No one's calling for a do nothing approach, as has been a common refrain throughout the course of the VMFRP or this SIAC's proceedings today. And we know too that in the environmental water holders and indeed the catchment manager know where they want to get water. They know they want to be able to water the floodplain when it needs it, and we know they have the water to do so and expect to have the water to do so. But they have no choice but to do nothing because they don't have a way to get the water where it needs to be. This is really the story of how it came to be that the Burra Creek project was identified and developed. And I'll just share on my screen now part of the environment report that we haven't spent much time on in the context of this roundtable, and that's part of the introductory section. I'm just sharing the table of contents of Chapter 2, which is described as policy context. As has been detailed in the EES Central Part A, and again, this chapter primarily details the history or the contextual basis for the projects in terms of the regulation of the Murray River through Section 2.1, and the future effects of climate change, including addressing the health of the Murray River floodplains overall, before turning to summarise the policy response through Section 2.2, the availability of environmental water in Section 2.3, consideration of alternative policy interventions in Section 2.4, and then in 2.5, identifying how it was the VMFRP projects came to be identified. If we go there to page 2.30 of the Environment Report, just wanted to draw the committee's attention to the basis upon which the Burra Creek project was chosen as one of the 12 projects first assessed as sustainable diversion limit projects. They were chosen, I'm reading from the second paragraph here, for the high biodiversity values present on site, the ecological benefits that could be achieved on site, the ability of the site to contribute to a representative mosaic of floodplain systems, that is, those that were not well addressed by the Living Murray program in the early 2010s, the feasibility of delivering water to the sites with works, and the ability to avoid or manage risks. Burra Creek was identified as a high-value ecological site in that context, and a site at which there was a need to get more water out to particular areas of the floodplain, and the ability to use works to do that. Then coming back to the question of what is the benefit of the project and why intervene at Burra Creek. Paragraph 8 and onwards of the Part C submission now before the committee in table document B50 seek to address this question of what are the benefits which flow from the project. They're cast in terms first of the question of terrestrialisation and what the current condition of the floodplain are, before turning then to the question of what's expected to follow from the project. So to address the committee on the basis of paragraph 11 and following, we look first at this question of terrestrialisation, which was explored in this SIAC's context in EES Central Technical Note 8, which explains how the relevant assessment packages have conceived of the proposition of terrestrialisation very much consistently with the discussion that's been had in this roundtable, including through questions from Member Brisger in respect of the various ways in which terrestrialisation can be observed and characterised as occurring. In broad part, it represents the response of floodplains as they dry up. And that's the basis upon which I'll talk to it in my high-level terms, where the committee's received its relevant evidence of ecologists in respect of it. I note at paragraph 12 that terrestrialisation, being symptomatic of threatening processes jeopardising floodplains' health and their associated values, has been recognised in the specific context of the Murray River floodplains and globally for more than half a century. There's research and literature which establishes the basis on which the link between river regulation and that degrading process and threatening process has been identified. And it's that literature which fed into the policy response that we talk to in the EES Central Part A and that the Chapter 2 of the Environment Report speaks to. Basis of that process and the way that it's been recognised, the 4 key principles then set out at paragraph 14 and onward of B50 can be observed. First, there is overwhelming policy support for active measures to restore floodplains where terrestrialisation has occurred or is anticipated to occur, and to prevent serious and irreversible harm to floodplains which would result if it was allowed to continue to occur unchecked. And here there are a number of paragraphs which refer back to that policy response and setting. Second, it's the case that VMFRP projects, including this one, seek to restore floodplains to a more natural condition by providing for an inundation regime which is more closely aligned with the inundation regime which would have been experienced with the Murray River in its natural or pre-regulation conditions. We observe that as a principle in the context of the listing of potentially threatening processes under the FFG Act, including altered hydrology, degradation of native vegetation and wetland loss and degradation as a result of change in water regime. And we observe in that paragraph 15.1 that it is appropriate to proceed on the basis that measures which arrest or seek to reverse those processes are best understood as being ecologically beneficial. We also note at paragraph 15.2 that experience shows us that managed inundation, just as natural inundation, managed inundation which better aligns with natural inundation regimes is capable of restoring floodplain condition and protecting floodplain condition. I refer in paragraph 15.2 to the examples given in EES Central Technical Note 8, and the committee's been referred to the MDBA's Icon Site report card system today. I understood there to be a reference to the 2015-2016 monitoring cycle there, and to the fact that that identified that progress hadn't been as fast as hoped, or that the monitoring at that point indicated that there hadn't been dramatic increases in condition at a particular location unnamed. We, in the Part A submission for the Central, as well as in Technical Note 8, have identified some report card outcomes more recently up to 21-22, which indicate that as a whole and across the Icon sites, it's in fact the case that environmental watering as well as natural inundation have been identified as improving the condition and resulting in achievement of relevant ecological indicators and objectives. Yes, it's the case, of course, that environmental watering takes time, and a long time in some cases, to achieve its ultimate objectives. Many of the ultimate objectives of the Living Murray project, just as every other environmental watering program, are not yet achieved, in the sense that there is an ambition to always result in improvement and to always achieve a better outcome. That does not indicate that environmental watering is not worthwhile or does not succeed in achieving its ecological ends on the basis of its conceived controls and adaptive management processes. The third principle observed here at paragraph 16 is that it's the objective of the VMFRP to conserve and restore these floodplains. And in that context, it follows that the extent to which the VMFRP will achieve ecological benefits cannot be understood solely by reference to the predicted responses of particular vegetation now present on the floodplain, as predicted in the AIB by the application of tools commonly used in the native vegetation regulation context or otherwise. And it's also the case that future environmental watering decision-making will not necessarily be premised on an intention to deliver water to relevant parts of the floodplain by reference to what's there today, or solely by reference to current inundation patterns. Of course, there will be circumstances in which environmental watering will be implemented to respond to particular needs of extant vegetation or other ecological values, particular species or communities or processes, where it's appropriate to do so, having regard to the full suite of considerations in respect of the floodplain in the context of the floodplain-wide or whole of floodplain management decision-making matrix in which environmental water decision-making is made. And it's on that basis, as described at paragraph 16.3, that what's proposed as the Burra Creek project now is intended to provide for and is designed to provide for a high degree of adaptive management in response to environmental conditions as matters progress. Of course, the ER, like the other assessment packages, presents the potential operating scenarios and attributed relationships with particular vegetation as a basis on which this assessment can be made, and as a basis which will inform, which has informed the potential operating scenarios, which would then be taken forward into the environmental water decision-making context. But actually, operations, of course, will be adapted over time. And then fourth, VMFRP projects, including this Burra Creek project, are not solely justified by reference to poor existing conditions of the relevant floodplains now, or particular ecosystems and processes on them, but rather they're proposed with the long-term objective of protecting and maintaining floodplain habitat into the future, in the context both of existing regulated river flows and risks associated with climate change. I then move in the submission to identify, by way of referencing the relevant exhibited material and the addendum documents, where it is that Dr. King and other experts have identified, and the authors of the specialist assessments have identified instances of what we've called here terrestrialisation, and what's otherwise been referred to in the context generally of declines in condition or poor condition instances of First Native vegetation and then other matters. I won't read these in detail. The committee's received the evidence of Dr. King, of Mr. Benyere, and of Mr. Watson. Paragraph 18 identifies where surveys have indicated vegetation of particular conditions, and in particular it was noteworthy through Dr. King's evidence that it's not just a matter of low condition of existing vegetation, or indeed the dead vegetation, which might have followed the Millennium Drought or other instances, but matters of poor recruitment, poor condition through canopy, and sparse and non-diverse under and mid-story. In the context of the Lignum Swampy Woodland EVC, the evidence of canopy species recruitment in present conditions was very limited. It was present at 9 of 26 sample sites, and by contrast, terrestrial species were identified at 18 of 26 sample sites. Section 19 goes on, paragraph 19 then goes on to talk to section 5 of the updated specialist assessment in the context of the observations regarding terrestrialisation as understood, having regard to the updated understanding of the Waikor backwater effect, and addresses the fact that in that context, there's an observation of a comparatively greater likelihood that some areas of particular EVCs, and in particular up to 50 hectares of the Lignum Swampy Woodland, may transition to likely pre-regulation EVCs, where there's a higher makeup of species with higher inundation preferences, such as Lignum Swamp. And then paragraph 20 addresses fauna, paragraph 20 addresses terrestrial fauna, 21 aquatic fauna in brief terms, identifying there that there's a declining indication of condition over time, including by reference to the 2004 and then the 2010 index of stream condition, having regard to the fact that those are the published dates of that index of stream condition reporting. Now, of course, there's then been discussion through the roundtable of what this all means in the context of the floodplain environment as characterised by boom and bust patterns or conditions. First, in my submission, the committee can be confident and can reach a conclusion that whatever the boom and bust cycle that is now occurring on the floodplain, it is not one which is consistent with the natural patterns that would have been experienced by the floodplain prior to the regulation of the river, and of course prior to the modification of the floodplain itself. And it can reach that conclusion quite simply on the basis of the lack of alignment between the current inundation regime and that which has been identified as being the likely regime through the updated specialist assessment. Second, I should note, sorry, before I go on, that Dr. King also observed in the context of those questions around, well, what vegetation suffered as a result of the Millennium Drought and how does this boom and bust cycle match up with what's being observed, that some of the indications of decline observed are not matters consistent with the shorter term cycles, but the longer term trends of ecological decline otherwise recognised. Excuse me. Second, as supported by the both the specialist assessment, including its review of the historical literature, extending through and over the various inundation events of recent decades, and as supported by the local knowledge and experience shared with the committee by the submitters, while it's apparent that the bust broader inundation events like those of the last 12 months is not the true boom that but to use Ms. Thornton's words of this morning, a blip. As the expert evidence establishes, both in the context of this roundtable, but also as was the case in ES Central and NIA and VMFRP, it's not enough to have or to the type that's been experienced over the last 12 months, but rather it's important to provide for and ensure a regularity of smaller events in the time intervening. And it's that pattern that is to ensure that frequency and duration is not just characterised by those large events, but by the smaller events in between, which leads to the need to enable environmental water decision makers to be able to ensure that those intervening or intermediate events are provided. I say intermediate there in a temporal sense, not by reference to the language of the relevant operating scenarios which were in the exhibited environment report. And if it's not the case that we can provide for those intervening events, that we can supplement the larger events that we might have had in the last 12 months with further events in coming years, there will be an expectation of less boom and more bust into the future. So to move back to the submission at paragraph 22, this question of why the reversal of terrestrialisation will deliver ecological benefit was put to me, I think on the first day of the hearing. That is to say, why is it assumed, or what underpins the assumption that it will be a good thing to undo terrestrialisation or to seek to protect against it? And first, as set out at paragraph 22, that's said on the basis that the reversal of terrestrialisation can be taken to represent a benefit or to achieve improvements for biodiversity on the basis of the key principles set out above and in ES Central Technical Note 8. That's because the current condition of the floodplain understood in ecological, cultural, social and economic contexts to the extent they should be supported. And second, because in my submission and in the conceptualisation of the projects, it's understood that the reversal of terrestrialisation is equivalent to the restoration and conservation of floodplain vegetation and habitat. Paragraphs 24 to 25 then go on to address expected or predicted outcomes of inundation, in particular at paragraph 24.1 in respect of native vegetation, addressing those matters that I referred to in summary through Dr. King's evidence, and then in respect of terrestrial fauna at paragraph 24.2, as well, it's the case there in respect of terrestrial fauna and in respect of aquatic fauna as observed at paragraph 25, that ultimately the proposition that those faunal species which enjoy and use habitats supported by floodplain vegetation will be positively affected by increased availability and condition of their habitats in various ways. At paragraph 26, it's observed that insofar as there's now a better understanding of both the pre-regulation and existing inundation regimes, insofar as that's led to the conclusion that there has been more extensive terrestrialisation than that was identified for the purpose of the exhibited environment report, this supports a conclusion that the benefit of the project is greater than that assessed at the time of exhibition of the ER. That follows from if the committee accepts my submissions in respect of the reversal of terrestrialisation and in respect of the predicted outcomes arrived at by the assessment and by the experts. I note there that in the context of the particular confined purpose of the assessment of overall improvement for biodiversity, that document seeks to, well, it avoids quantifying any benefit associated with the reversal of the terrestrialisation in the sense that I've just taken the committee to, and rather identifies the relevant change as neutral. From paragraph 27, I address the discussion, particularly through the evidence of Dr. King, of what were described by Dr. King and indeed by the Environment Report as the recommended inundation frequency ranges or parameters of the Fruit and Pappas Guide, which is the 2016 DELP document. And how those ranges, parameters, related to the indicative inundation frequencies in particular set out in table 6.18 of the updated specialist assessment, of the updated project description. And I've taken, by example, the most dominant EVC, the lignum swampy woodland EVC, and the fact that there was focus on the apparent alignment between its, what's understood to be its existing pattern of inundation at a frequency of 3.7 events in 10 years, and the Fruit and Pappas Guide indication that the authors of that document have observed that EVC experiencing inundation between 3 and 7 years in every 10. And that's in comparison to the proposition that the project would be able to achieve through its potential operating scenarios, inundation of that EVC across the floodplain at an average of 7.8 in 10 years. And the proposition that that 7.8 is higher than the 7 of the Fruit and Pappas Guide. At paragraph 28, we've identified that the fact that there's that alignment is not in any way surprising, because its parameters are based upon the usual frequency of inundation that EVCs experienced in the observations of its authors. And on the basis that those observations, as they have been translated into those parameters of that guide, are general and they're agnostic to the characteristics of particular locations. This, of course, is supported by the observations in the relevant ecological associates consideration of the expert elicitation report, which arrives at similar conclusions as to the Fruit and Pappas Guide in terms of what those experts identified as the frequency and duration of inundation experienced by that EVC today. We do note that that guide does not make recommendations in respect of how often or for how long, or indeed how deeply, any particular EVC should be inundated, and note Mr. Frood himself having observed in the EES central context that its ranges are too coarse to inform a particular understanding of the expected response of vegetation. And so we, again, consistently with submissions previously made, consider that the Fruit and Pappas Guide is one input into future decision making, as will other things like the expert elicitation report and the ecological associates consideration of that report. But it ought not be given, in my submission, a weight which exceeds that role. In particular, it ought not be given weight as indicating whether or not the project ought to achieve a better alignment or provide for a better alignment of inundation regime with natural. And it ought not be used as a document which can be taken to dictate what will, or to determine what would the responses of particular EVCs or species be. We've known at paragraph 31 that we addressed in the Part A submission and described further here that the benefit of the project isn't affected by the delta between, or the difference between, what was understood about the regime of inundation of the floodplain at the time of the exhibited ER and what's now understood in the updated or the addendum documents. In particular, the fact that the floodplain is now understood to be inundated to an extent which, or at a frequency which generally aligns with what was once described as the watering objective of the project, doesn't indicate that the project is now obsolete or not needed, because what's important is the indication that conditions of the floodplain now are inconsistent with the proposition that it's experiencing an appropriate inundation regime, and similarly, having regard to the better understanding of the natural inundation regime, it's appropriate that the project has provided in the updated watering scenarios and objectives for better alignment with those better understood natural patterns. It's that alignment with the natural regime which is sought to be, or the difference between the natural regime and the current regime, which is sought to be narrowed through those operating scenarios and objectives. And as observed at paragraph 32, that's particularly critical to the protection of the floodplain into the future, because it's through that better alignment and through the flexibility which the project affords that environmental water managers would be able to water with confidence that what they were doing is consistent with natural conditions. And it's the flexibility afforded by the projects which would enable water managers to intervene should there be periods of prolonged drought into the future. And that's not necessarily a millennium drought style scale event. As I said earlier, it's a matter of ensuring that the pattern of inundation provides for large events to be backed up as much as anything else. Here, again, noting that what I've just been through is addressing a couple of propositions in terms of the benefit of the projects in a broad sense, and particularly this question of Burra Creek and its terrestrialisation and so on. I'll just pause to note that otherwise I observe the environment report supports conclusions which have not been explored in the context of this roundtable process in respect of benefits of the project associated with a broader range of considerations than this higher end proposition. Ultimately, I submit to this committee that it's in a position, empowered by the environment report and addendum documents, to reach conclusions in respect of the benefits of the projects in respect of social and economic matters, together with those cultural matters which we'll come to address in the context of speaking to Aboriginal cultural heritage values soon. Each of which, like the environmental or the capacity of the projects to achieve environmental benefits in the EES central context, the Minister concluded would be significant in their benefit and would result in improvements to ecology and to biodiversity, subject to effective risk mitigation through implementation of recommendations of the SIAC and the Minister's assessment. Now, from page 15 and paragraph 34, the submission goes on to address environmental effects. And it does so, again, with a focus on those matters addressed in the roundtable, rather than the balance of matters addressed in respect of other matters set out in the environment report and addendum documents, and without restating evidence that the committee received. The first area really is water, surface water and groundwater. And in this respect, my submission to the committee is that it's the primary conclusions to be taken from the evidence of Dr. Treadwell and Mr. Hoxley are that the operation of the projects will give rise to benefits and potential impacts which are consistent with those experienced in natural inundation events. That in particular, the projects will not inundate any land which has not historically been inundated as part of the relevant floodplain, and will not preclude the inundation of any land beyond the maximum inundation areas, and that the potential for construction to give rise to impacts has been properly assessed to a degree consonant with relevant risk and on a systems view, and the proposed EDSs provide for potential impacts to be avoided, or where avoidance is not possible, minimised and managed within acceptable parameters. I note in particular Mr. Hoxley's identification that of the VMFRP projects, as far as potential groundwater and salinity impacts go, Burra Creek is particularly low risk. I also note then Dr. Treadwell's response to questions on notice, which is filed as tabled document B48 on, I think, Thursday of last week, excuse me, has identified in response to a particular question in respect of the what we'll call backwater effect and what I'll just call the northern infrastructure. So I think it's Northern A Bank and Northern B Bank and the number 1 and number 2 spillway, which the committee is focused on having some potential to react with or to interact with inflows at the northern end of Burra Creek and around. Dr. Treadwell's identified that insofar as it's the case that the reconnecting river country model has been used for the hydrological purposes and for the purposes of understanding the Walkall backwater effect, and the Jacobs 2014-2017 model has been used for the purpose of understanding the hydraulic behaviours within the floodplain in particular. There is the potential for some further hydraulic analysis of that backwater effect to provide a more refined understanding of inflow points at the northern extent of the Burra North WMA, and that this could appropriately inform a detailed design, including particularly of spillways in the northern containment banks. And that, as I understand it, relates particularly to, I'm sorry, just bear with me a moment. I've got a page from the map book here at PDF page 10 on the screen. I'm talking to, as I understand Dr. Treadwell's recommendation, these northern two containment banks, A and B, and spillway number 1 and number 2. And I observe, looking over at table document 51 and the new maps, I'm switching between the two as separate PDFs here to observe that there's a natural low point here and a natural low point here. I hope you can see my cursor well enough. Perhaps I'll just indicate where I'm. There's a natural low point here and a natural low point here, which relate to the location of spillway number 1 and spillway number 2. And the committee will observe that perhaps better on its own screen than as I flick back and forth between the two maps here. But as I understand the thrust of Dr. Treadwell's recommendation, he's indicating that in circumstances where the containment bank is deliberately located and the spillways are deliberately located, having regard to those potential points of inflow and outflow to and from the floodplain and between the Murray River and the floodplain and perhaps Burra Creek and the floodplain, it's always been understood that those are locations for that sort of movement, and the Jacobs model supports that. But in light of the reconnecting river country model and the Walkall effect, he has recommended that it be worthwhile for that to be the subject of further hydraulic assessment if the committee sees that appropriate for the purpose of informing the detailed design of those spillways. In that context, I understand that to be the case because I move to PDF page 50 of the map book. The committee will observe the typical detail of spillways where the committee will be familiar with my efforts to identify the freeboard levels associated with containment banks as a general proposition across the site. The way the spillways are typically designed is to provide for 100 mil freeboard above the design water level to the upstream sill of the spillway. Alter depths downstream of the containment bank, it's appropriate for that to be factored into detailed design. Dr. Treadwell goes on to note that in the context of the EES Central Committee's recommendations, and particularly their proposed new EDS SW4, if the committee was minded to ensure through project controls that that be done, EDS SW4 as recommended in that context would cover it. I'll come back to the EDSs and project controls towards the end of the submission. The otherwise at paragraph 39, we note in this context that the Jacobs hydraulic modelling supports the conclusion that these matters don't mean there's an issue with any part of the floodplain being cut off inadvertently or unintentionally from flooding by project infrastructure, given it establishes that the floodplain within the MIA and in the general area of the inflow points around these spillways is still inundated with the containment banks and spillways in place via breakouts from the Burra Creek channel rather than from the Murray River or from outside the MIA to the north. And we've provided references there to the figures which display that, having regard to particularly, we've looked at table document 13A or B13A, pardon me, as the best place at which that's all collated. So we note at paragraph 40 in my submission, that's a matter which might both feed into that detailed design proposition and the EES Central Committee's recommendations to first, the demonstration of an overall improvement for biodiversity for the purposes of clause 4.6 of the draft incorporated document, and potentially into operating scenarios having regard to vegetation requirements as relevant to that EES Central Committee's recommendation. In my submission, that's not a matter required for the environmental effects of the project to be assessed on the basis of the environment report and the addendum documents, or for the committee here to produce its report on the basis of the benefit the project is capable of achieving in a way consistent with the approach of the EES Central Committee as accepted by the Minister in her assessment. Finally, we've noted at paragraph 41 that that's unlikely to mean containment banks would move, given the key considerations which have informed their location. And that again is a matter that I'll come back to briefly. The submission then goes on to ecology in general terms. It identifies, by way of a cross-reference to the matters that I've spent a bit more time walking through in respect of project benefit and terrestrialisation, how ecologists characterise existing conditions and what effects they each predict and have assessed the project to potentially have through its construction and then on through its operation. A moment is taken at paragraphs 44 to 45 to address the AOIB. Now, this has been identified a few times as a document prepared for a particular confined purpose, as distinct from representing the proponent's fundamental propositions in terms of the overall benefit of the project, but rather to address really to address the native vegetation regulations balancing process associated with the de facto application of the conservation works exemption. I'll leave the more detailed explanation of that, particularly to the attachment to the proponent's Part C submission in EES Central, which is referred to here. That's at footnote 63. This document, the AOIB, seeks to address those fundamental propositions I've referred to about project benefit, particularly in section 5, which addresses in general terms and qualitative terms the better alignment of the inundation regime with the natural, and in section 6 through addressing ecosystem function improvements, including having regard to the long-term watering plan for the Murray. In an overall sense, it assumes better alignment of inundation regime with natural conditions will be beneficial to biodiversity, which in my submission and for the reasons I've gone through is an appropriate assumption where the extent of interference with natural conditions is recognised and where the consequences of that current misalignment with the natural inundation regime is recognised or are recognised. And it's an approach which in my submission is validated by the expert evidence that the committee's received, which has included the identification of predicted responses. It goes on there and elsewhere in section 7 and 8 in particular to seek to quantify responses of particular species. Again, the committee will be familiar with the position that the proponent takes in respect of those efforts to quantify. They do what can be done with the tools available in circumstances where it is ultimately seeking to do something typically out of reach of environmental impact assessment processes, and that's in the context of seeking to use or seeking to predict and in many cases quantify responses in the absence of scientific responses which allow or approaches which allow that to objectively be done, as might be done in the case of air emissions or noise emissions or so on. But using the tools that we have to do the best that can be done to seek to quantify those responses. In terms of the AOIB, the committee, the SIAC has received presentations from Ms. Chapman in terms of the methodology they've adopted and submissions from the proponent in terms of how and why that's been done. And they remain apposite and continue to be relied upon. Note here that the apprehended the AIB to have utility in the context of future native vegetation decision making, subject to some recommendations which were made in each context. Now, from paragraph 46, matters relating to Aboriginal cultural heritage are addressed. And fundamentally, the propositions here are propositions which again have been made in past proceedings, but which again were the subject of particular submissions. The submission here, this Part C submission, starts by identifying that in respect of the Barra Creek project, submissions were received first in response to the exhibition of the ER, submissions 1 to 14, and second, the 2 submissions received in respect of the Barra Creek addendum. The issues raised in submissions 1 to 14 have been addressed both in table document B20 here, but were addressed really in the context of the Naira and VMFRP projects as well. And they were issues, therefore, which were live in the mind of both the committee, the parties, and all persons involved in the relevant theme day in the context of the Naira and VMFRP project, which enabled the benefit of that personal setting to be enjoyed and relevant values and matters to be addressed and discussed. None of the submissions before the committee are identified as being made with the authority of traditional owners or traditional owner groups. The submissions constitute all of those submissions before the committee in circumstances where via the CMA invitations were sent to traditional owners and groups to participate. And in general terms, the proponent takes the view that the basis on which it has previously addressed matters relevant to Aboriginal cultural heritage remains accurate and apposite. It continues to rely on its Part C submission in EES Central and the Naira and VMFRP projects, and it relies upon the update that it's provided as part of the Naira and VMFRP roundtable in respect of traditional owner consultation, which also applies to the Barra Creek project. I'm skipping down really to paragraph 54 first to observe that it's entirely appropriate in the proponent submission for the committee to rely on the inputs and submissions from previous VMFRP packages as foreshadowed in its directions. It's also entirely appropriate for the committee to continue to proceed on the basis upon which the proponent invited it to proceed in the context of those earlier packages. And fundamentally, my submission is, first, it's particularly important for this process to respect the wishes of any person, any interested party, and any traditional owner to not participate. It would be equally important for the process to respect the wishes of those who did choose to participate in the Naira and VMFRP roundtable and contribute to that. But where there has been a choice to not participate, that must be respected. Second, views or comments expressed in the context of this roundtable, all those views expressed in the consultation and engagement conducted outside of it should not be attributed to any person other than the person who expressed them. And that's particularly the case where persons purport to speak for others or to convey others' views without the express authority to do so. And third, contrary to a submission that was made, neither Lower Murray Water nor any VMFRP partner agency speaks for any traditional owners or interested parties, whether or not they chose to participate or to not participate in any relevant processes. What's presented through the environment report and through the additional material provided to the committee summarises and identifies the basis on which the proponent and its partner agencies have approached both the assessment of potential impacts on Aboriginal cultural heritage through the relevant specialist assessment in particular and updates in respect of CHMPs, and also summarise the basis on which the proponent and its partner agencies both have sought to understand traditional owner aspirations and views in respect of the projects and the floodplains to which they relate, but also to inform the basis on which continuing processes of engagement would be engaged with moving forward should the project be approved. I note here that, as in EE Essential and Nyra and VMFRP, the proposed project controls in respect of Burra Creek would involve ongoing traditional owner engagement in relation to a large number of, or the preparation of a large number of documents and then their implementation. And that would include the Environmental Water Management Plan, the Seasonal Watering Proposal, the Seasonal Watering Plan, the Delivery Plan, Seasonal Watering Statement, the Operating Plan, Operations and Maintenance Plan, and then consultation generally in terms of land and waterway management, bushfire management, the Ecological MER Plan and the Socioeconomic MER Plan, and then otherwise the monitoring program through the EMF, including the specific monitoring requirements in respect of Aboriginal cultural heritage. Those matters were noted and identified by the committee in terms of EE Central and by the Minister, and I invite the committee to reach the conclusions summarised at paragraph 56 of the Part C submission, which are consistent with those reached in the context of EE Central. I now move to the final part of the Part C submission, which addresses project development, operation and controls. The first part of this submission really addresses the detail of Chapter 4 and Attachment 8 to the Environment Report in the context of the discussion that we've had around, in particular, the location of infrastructure having regard to existing infrastructure and particularly to proximity to, I'll just say waterways, particularly the Murray River's banks. In my submission, it's a case here, as it was with previous packages, that the processes of project development, which have been conducted over more than a decade before today, and which have involved very substantial consultation with stakeholders, including traditional owners and interested parties, and very substantial and very detailed technical input, represent substantial efforts to avoid and minimise impacts and to achieve feasibly and practically to achieve the objectives of the projects to water the maximum extent of the floodplain which can reasonably be watered. And in that context, the proponent submits that the committee should recommend investigation of any further alternatives, that is, alternatives not disclosed in Attachment 8 and not representative of, I was about to use the word simple, that's probably not right, not those alternatives explored in Attachment 8 and not further efforts to avoid and minimise through the refinement of construction footprints and so on as would be required by EDS E1. Only where necessary to ensure that the environmental effects of the projects are acceptable and always having regard to the processes already carried out and upon which the project design has been based. We address at paragraph 60 and onwards, I address part of the generic 30-metre buffer applied across all waterways by clauses 12031S and 14021S of the SPPF, in which case, fundamentally, I maintain the submission that it should be the site-specific assessment of values and potential impacts which is preferred over the generic policy of those clauses, and that the achievement of the purposes and the objectives of those clauses through the delivery of the projects in order to protect and conserve these floodplain environments should be preferred to the application of the particular strategy or decision guideline which would call for that 30-metre buffer, particularly insofar as that may require compromises to the ability of the projects to achieve the desired inundation extent. It's clearly been the case that through those processes of project development, infrastructure has generally been sited where the floodplain is disturbed, along existing access tracks and the like, or in the case of location of regulators, particularly where there is existing interruption of waterways, blockages to waterways, particularly I'm thinking of regulators B1 and I mean, it's escaped my mind at the moment. Obviously, the use of the existing block bank, but also the regulator at the southern end of the North WMA, where that's been done in order to minimise the impact of introducing new regulators into that waterway. Now, that's not necessarily indicative of a simplistic or blithe assumption that there's no better option than to co-locate with existing disturbances. Rather, there's explanation given as to how the siting of infrastructure represents detailed investigation of alternate infrastructure locations and efforts made in the course of project development to maximise beneficial areas while reducing areas impacted. The next matter then addressed at paragraph 62 and onwards is the question of consultation and engagement more generally. Now, I've spoken, of course, to Aboriginal cultural heritage and to the processes undergone there. In general terms and consistent with the finding of the Minister in respect of EES Central, I invite the committee to conclude that the consultation and engagement undertaken in respect of the project and the environment report and addendum documents, and indeed the draft PSA, has been adequate, and to recommend that no additional consultation is required. Now, there has, of course, been some suggestion that or questions around how much particular stakeholders participated or when. I simply refer the committee to attachment 9, which identifies who was consulted and when, and I note further the requirements proposed in the EMF and EDS, which would require appropriate consultation with stakeholders in the community during the delivery and operation of the project. I then move on. You'll be pleased to know my WhatsApp is bouncing with suggestions that I identify regulator B2 as the other matter that I was talking to. The proposed project controls is the next section of the Part C submission, and this really just identifies, as I did on day one, that it's day one proposed EDS and monitoring requirements, that is those put forward by the proponent, represent the fact that the proponent is continuing to work through recommendations of the Minister's assessment and, of course, of the committee in respect of EES Central, and how those recommendations are appropriately addressed in the context of the future requests and applications that it will have to make for decisions and approvals. In that context, it's premature for Lower Murray Water to seek to determine which and precisely how those recommendations should be applied to the Burra Creek project, and that's why fundamentally what the committee now has before it as Lower Murray Water's day one EDS and incorporated documents, and of course monitoring requirements, include many changes made in the course of development of the final day documents from EES Central and consistent with the Naira and VMFRP projects, but don't involve many more changes other than those specific changes recommended by Dr. King in particular. The proponents conscious of important distinctions between VMFRP projects, such that it's not appropriate to simply adopt and carry forward all recommendations made in respect of one project or assessment package and apply them to all thereafter. That's clearly got the potential to result in undesirable outcomes, and clearly has the potential to pick up things which simply aren't relevant between projects, I would add. That said, and having regard to the recommendations of the EES Central Committee and Minister's assessment, the proponent does acknowledge that certain recommendations are likely to be appropriate to apply across packages, and that's particularly so in respect of drafting changes which can be characterised as clarifying particular requirements of proposed EDS or monitoring requirements and the like, and particularly where they relate to those more generic matters. That is to say then, I'll move on to paragraph 68. The proponent requests that the committee exercise care, as it undoubtedly will, in identifying any changes it will recommend in the context of the Burra Creek project to achieve or increase, to increase the benefits of the project, rather than being changes necessary to manage effects to within acceptable parameters. For example, it's been a characteristic of responses in this roundtable, as it was previously, that experts will, all of those really engaged in impact assessment, and particularly those experts now before the committee, will never identify more monitoring, more data gathering as a bad thing, or as something which they could possibly oppose on a scientific or environmental grounds in and of themselves. But insofar, for example, as there was discussion of the potential for monitoring of species like the regent parrot, in light of the potential that it might return to establish breeding habitat into the future, that sort of, including a monitoring requirement of that sort, would introduce obligations onto the project, which would come at a cost and at resource and considerations. And therefore, in the proponent's submission, should only be recommended where it's reasonably necessary to manage specific identified environmental effects attributable to the project, rather than simply where having more data would be beneficial to science as a general proposition. The fact that there is a balancing, of course, in the consideration of monitoring proposals reflects the fact that what's important is, in the proponent's submission, the monitoring of an ecosystem response, or the community-wide and floodplain-wide response, rather than particular species, save where monitoring is necessary having regard to an identified potential significant impact on a listed species or a particularly important species. And so, to go back to the regent parrot again, where monitoring in respect of that species was justified in the case of its breeding habitat at Balsayangara, prescribing the same requirement here is likely to result in a cost associated with monitoring without any real benefit, or perhaps, or with only a contingent benefit on a particular future uncertain outcome. There is, as I've noted at footnote 71, further discussion of how monitoring efforts can and should be prioritised at section 3.5 of the Ecological MER Plan. The paragraph 70 then briefly addresses carp as a proposition. I should note that in the context of the recommendations made in respect of EES Central and the issue of carp, and in light of other submissions that have been made and evidence that's been given about carp along the way, it's not the case, of course, that the proponent seeks to deny the existence of carp as a risk, or to do anything otherwise than to avoid it as an issue in terms of its proliferation and presence, which applies along the Murray River, and particularly in the case of inundation of floodplains and floodplains which support suitable spawning grounds. The basis, though, on which the day one EDS and monitoring requirements don't specifically call out carp or address that beyond the way that it's addressed through aquatic pest monitoring, for example, is because of the nature of carp as a basin-wide issue, which is likely to be fundamentally out of the control of and independent of the operation of the project, in circumstances where, consistent with the evidence of Mr. Marsden in respect of EES Central and Mr. Benier in respect of the ER Central projects, the fact that carp proliferation is a risk associated with inundation of the Burra Creek floodplain does not mean you wouldn't inundate the Burra Creek floodplain. Clearly, it's a matter which the committees grappled in the past through the EES Central project, and undoubtedly, though I'm not certain, but I presume through the NIRA and VMFRP projects, it's appropriate for us to note that the interaction between carp monitoring here and in respect to basin-wide strategies is unclear. The final thing to note in terms of the monitoring propositions is that where it has been noted that it will be desirable for additional data to be gathered, particularly in the context of the events of the last 12 months, the committee ought note that the ARI has commenced monitoring per the ecological MER plan and did so in 2021. Now, it's not the case that there's been data either produced, evaluated or reported upon, particularly in respect of Burra Creek, but it's certainly the case that if and as that data becomes available before each stage of this project or any other VMFRP project, regard will be had to it as appropriate. And so insofar, for example, as there are calls for particular efforts to be put into survey and assessment processes following the most recent inundation events, it's already been done, or it's being done as the condition of the floodplain will allow, perhaps. The MER plan, of course, itself is not intended to be a static document. It has provision for decisions to be made in respect of monitoring from time to time, but there is also the express requirement in the EMF for it to be updated and to be adaptive in response to the production of information. And the way the EMF talks about that is at least every 5 years, and reference to the location of that requirement is provided. At paragraph 75, the submission notes that, as was the case in the context of EES Central, and again in the NIRA and VMFRP projects, the principles of adaptive management as are applied and as underpin the Victorian and Commonwealth environmental watering frameworks, again, came under criticism as being the basis on which it said the proponent seeks to escape obligations to assess or predict matters now, or to fix itself to particular operating scenarios or outcomes now. Ultimately, the proponent relies upon everything it's said about this in terms of particularly its Part A submission in respect of EES Central and Part C submission in respect of the NIRA and VMFRP projects, as well as the EES Central Minister's assessment, which identified the critical need for effective adaptive management and identified that the application of adaptive management principles will allow project operations to respond to varying seasonal conditions and utilise knowledge gained from previous operation to continuously improve the watering programs. The reason adaptive management is preferred to fixing a particular operational scenario now is because in light of inherent uncertainty with or in relation to environmental responses to any intervention, including here watering, adaptive management will allow the project to maximise its benefits while minimising impacts through the ongoing and very robust framework established in respect of the environmental watering framework. And in that respect, I'd commend, to the extent the committee needs to do so, to refresh itself in respect of the application of those principles in the environmental watering framework, the Part A submission from EES Central to it. All that's left for me to do for my part now is to identify for the committee that since we last met last week, it's had uploaded and filed with it the KMZ file of photo locations contained in the presentation of Dr. King, noting that those photographs taken of the most recent flood event that Dr. King observed were not geolocated. So you have the pre-inundation photo locations. The committee also received Dr. Treadwell's response to questions taken on notice in technical note B6, which is table document B48, and Mr. Benier's response to questions taken on notice in respect of aquatic ecology, which is table document B49. As well as the Part C submission, then the committee's also received table document B51, which are those updated or new contour maps. And I'm informed that in the course of submissions today, that new mapping layer, which is shown on table document B51, has also been updated or included upon the ecology portal through the WebGIS system that's been provided to the committee for its review. So if there's a desire to be able to zoom in and move around and so on, the committee will be able to do that now. It might be necessary to refresh the portal. Now, the final conclusion of the Part C submission identifies that having regard to the overwhelming benefit of the project and the appropriate project controls as proposed, it's the proponent's ultimate submission that the committee should recommend the project be approved, subject to the proposed documentation and the recommendations it sees fit. And those conclude the submissions that I seek to make in closing.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Forrester. We've got a couple of questions for you, but I don't anticipate that will require a huge amount of time. So we should, well, I think we'll just proceed and we should finish around 1 o'clock. Just this war-cool effect. It essentially means the floodplain pre-regulation, so that what we call the natural inundation pattern, means that the floodplain was being inundated more often for longer durations than the modelling first predicted. But it also means the floodplain under current conditions is being inundated more often and for longer periods than the modelling predicted or first predicted. There remains a misalignment between what's happening now and what is thought to have happened pre-regulation. But what's the overall result of the war-cool effect? Is that misalignment bigger or smaller than the modelling first predicted?
Just bringing up on my screen table 6.18 of the track changes description, project description, so that we can identify where we're sitting. So there's not a simple answer to the question of whether it's bigger or smaller because of the nature of the changed understanding of the way in which the floodplain is behaving today and what would have been inundated in natural conditions. And I say that because, for example, there was previously the understanding that in the regulated river or existing conditions, the area of the floodplain inundated at an equivalent Murray River flow of 17,500 megalitres a day at Swan Hill was that it was inundated, by way of example, 6.8 times in 10 years. And the assessment of the modelling of the pre-regulation inundation regime was 3 times higher, or 3 events higher at 9.8 in 10 years.
Can you just make that a little bit bigger?
Of course, pardon me, yes.
Yeah.
There we are. So the difference there, if you just look at the gap between regulated river and pre-regulation at 3 events in 10 years, well, we've got now the difference between the regulated river existing conditions at 10 in 10 and the pre-regulation at 14 and 10. So the gap's gone up. There's one more difference.
Yeah.
one event more that the floodplain is not receiving in current regulated conditions. And so there, the gap's higher. Similarly, in terms of just the bottom row of the table, which has changed in a couple of ways, but previously in respect of the black box woodland and red gum forest and woodland EWRCs watered by the borough maximum scenario, the difference was 0.2 events every 10 years. It went from, the difference was between 0.4 in natural conditions and 0.2 in existing or regulated conditions. And so the gap is significantly greater here in the sense that now it's understood to be still a matter of doubling. You know, it's 100% more still, as between 8.1 in natural conditions and 3.7 in the reduced inundation regime of existing conditions. But of course, that's 4 or more than 4 events in 10 years, which the floodplain is not receiving as a result of the regulation of the river. Things change a bit, of course, because of the better understanding of how the lignum, shrubland, woodland EWRC is inundated in existing conditions, and would be inundated in natural conditions, in the sense that that's been rolled into the bottom row, the Borough maximum scenario. And in those circumstances, we can liken the gap in a similar way, in the sense that on average across the floodplain, the lignum, shrubland and woodland, like the other EWRCs, is understood to have been inundated at an average frequency of 8.1 in 10 years, and is now receiving the lower regulated river figure of 3.7. But of course, the understanding is simply different from the outset. I don't think it's necessarily a valid comparison to be simply saying the gap's bigger and so there's more need. It's just a better understanding of what that gap looks like and how that inundation is occurring. The important difference, I suppose, is in terms of the magnitude of project benefit and what can be delivered. In terms of this, sticking on the bottom row for a second, we can see that the project is capable of delivering that extra 3 events in 10 years. So the frequency there for the Borough maximum scenario is at 3 events in 10 years, again, approaching that 50% more, 4.8 up to 7.8, as compared with the basin plan without VMFRP scenario. Whereas previously it was 0.2 to 0.3. So there was certainly an increase, but the number of operations, of course, was lower. The gap, therefore, in terms of inundation frequency, is most significant in terms of the Borough maximum scenario. There's obviously a gap in respect of seasonal Anabranch and Billabong in the seasonal fresh scenario, but the difference of the VMFRP here is not about frequency necessarily, although noting, as I did in comments made in submissions, frequency might also be cloaking here considerations of timing, in the sense that the basin plan 11 won't necessarily match with the basin plan with VMFRP 11, where the VMFRP 11 also allows environmental waterers to be flexible and responsive in a way that the basin plan would not. But the difference there is that it's the duration which is important in terms of the seasonal fresh scenario, in the sense that the VMFRP will enable the pre-regulation duration of 2.6 months to be met, whereas in the regulated river scenario, that's down at 1 month, and in basin plan 1.6 months. So the second half of the gap, and the question of has the gap gotten bigger, relates to this question of duration. And here, I've spoken to the seasonal fresh gap. It changes from 5.2 in pre-regulation and 2.8 in regulated, and on the previous understanding, down to shorter durations. And understanding that for the seasonal fresh scenario, there's a duration of 2.6 months and now a duration of 1 month. That's it's just a different proposition in terms of duration, because it's less about, I suppose, the difference between those two numbers, and more about an accurate reading of durations, having regard to the ecological needs of the floodplain. Similarly, there's a gap in terms of the Borough maximum scenario row, but again, the gap's just a different one, in the sense that, in fact, what's happened now is the pre-regulation duration is understood to be up at 1.2 months, as compared with the regulated river at 0.8 months, whereas previously, and like the understanding of the Borough maximum equivalent, frequency down at the 0.2, 0.3 events every 10 years range the duration was understood to be lower at 0.5 months. But now the understanding of natural conditions is better at 1.2 months. And so I suppose the reason I'm hesitant to characterize these gaps as by comparison to the exhibited environment report being bigger or smaller, or the need for the project being fundamentally affected by the differences, is because ultimately they simply represent a better understanding of those pre-regulation conditions in particular. And so the extent to which the VMFRP gives us better alignment is just a question of, does it achieve better alignment with natural than the basin plan otherwise would? And so the comparison isn't necessarily helpful. What needs to be compared is what the VMFRP can do in light of the best knowledge that we have, which is now represented in the updated numbers of this table. If you do want to identify, well, did we previously think the floodplain was worse off or better off? It's possible to say that we now understand, particularly for the bottom row, the lignum shrubland and woodland, the black box woodland and the red gum forest and woodland, the floodplain needs much more frequent watering than we thought it did. And so in those circumstances, yes, it's there's more justification for the VMFRP project. But again, I'm reluctant to put this any higher than the overall objective of the program being better alignment, and the new understanding being a matter of better informing what can be that better alignment.
I think going back to that table was actually helpful. I mean, the interaction between frequency, duration, and then, you know, we've got to throw depth in on top of that as well, which is not necessarily reflected in this table. It is very complex, so there's a lot to kind of get our heads around there. But
Yes.
You said in paragraph 26 of your submission that terrestrialisation has been more extensive of the Burra Creek floodplain than was identified in the exhibited environment report. Is that an assumption based on the updated understanding of the pre-regulation inundation events, and an assumption that must have led to greater terrestrialisation than was first understood to have occurred?
Fundamentally, yes, it is, because it reflects the conclusion. Pardon me, I'll take a step back. It's in the context of that observation by Dr. King of the potential risk of reversion or conversion of one AVC to another, where it's identified that, well, to the extent there are some areas of the floodplain which contain species without a particular preference for floodplain habitats or for inundation that would otherwise match what they would have received in natural conditions, that is assumed to be reflective of what's happened to the floodplain over time. That's right. I'm not sure it's truly tacking onto that answer, but I just wanted to observe in respect of that table 6.18, the other thing that, of course, it doesn't identify, because perhaps it can't, is the question of timing, as distinct from depth and extent, of course, is one matter, being as depth is obviously related to extent in the sense that we're not altering the floodplain, and so the question is how much water goes out and therefore where does it get to. But the other relevant matter is timing, and I'm not sure I raised it in the course of my somewhat messy answers in respect to table 6.18, but the question of frequency and that question of the flexibility of water managers also relate not just to how often, but to when in the year, to when the water can go out. Yeah.
Okay. This is a question that we've been grappling with since the roundtable started, and I think we did pose it, if not on day one, then it might have been on day two, about the updated project description resulting in inundation that is more extensive than is recommended in the Fruit and Pappas guide. Now, I note what you say about the Fruit and Pappas guide in paragraph 28 of your submission. And we note also Dr. King's evidence that he acknowledged that the watering patterns proposed are slightly more extensive than those recommended in the Fruit and Pappas guide, but he nevertheless expects there to be greater benefits. It does still in our minds raise a question for the need for the project, or whether the project might be overreaching if it's going beyond the recommendations in the Fruit and Pappas guide. And this is in the context of what you just explained in reference to table 6.18, but there's just still a niggling little voice in the back of my head saying, why are we doing it? Because any benefits that the project is going to deliver have to be weighed against the impacts that the project will have. So we still have to do that net benefit balancing exercise. Is there anything you wanted to sort of say about that further?
There are two things, and they come in addition to those things you've identified, what we've said otherwise at paragraph 28, and more broadly in respect of these processes of trying to pin down in a quantitative sense and with certainty what a particular ecological community or what any particular plant, to take it down to that level, is going to do in circumstances of an ecosystem which is inherently uncertain and dependent upon so many different interactions that cannot be included into or fed into a particular tool for quantitative assessment that way. And into that category go not so much the Fruit and Pappas guide or the expert elicitation report or anything, but any effort to then take what's said in those documents as indicating with certainty what might happen. It's not the guides that are the issue. It would be any decision to rely upon the guides as being determinative or restrictive in terms of ecological or environmental management decisions. That would be, in my submission, the problematic bit.
Yeah.
So in addition to that, in addition to what Dr. King's actual evidence is in terms of the predicted responses on the floodplain, the only other thing the two things to really note are, first, coming back to that question of terrestrialisation and those other matters that we've identified in that context. So the inundation at the upper end of the 7.8 events in 10 years is, in Dr. King's evidence, related to that question of potential impact, particularly on the trees. And so that's then related to the question of terrestrialisation and accepting as a basic proposition, as the proponent invites the committee to do, that changes of that nature, that is to say, if there is an impact associated with 7.8 rather than 7 events in 10 years, let's assume that that was the practical outcome of the project, or the practical inundation of the floodplain for a moment. If there was an impact represented by that 0.8 events in 10 years, then it would be an impact which, if realised, was representative of this restoration proposition. But the second thing is taking a step back from the very proposition that we can simply assess the project on the basis of the 7.8 figure. And as I said earlier today, and as the committee obviously knows, it's not proposed that the project will operate 7.8 times in 10 years and that'll be that. And there are obviously going to be many factors which come along before, assuming the project was built and ready to operate. The decision to operate it for the first time might be affected by a further inundation event, might be affected by some other change, ecologically significant change along the way to the floodplain, which is to be responded to, might be affected by not just an inundation event, but what happened before it, or perhaps circumstances happening during it. It's just not, it's not realistic to proceed on the basis that, well, Fruit and Pappas say up to 7, project says 7.8 on average, or 7.8 indicatively. That's more, and so that might be bad. Now, that said, of course, there's been the assumption of the watering scenarios and the watering objectives for the purposes of this process. And this is one of the instances in which, again, consistent with things that have been said to this committee in the past, the difficulty of this EES or the environment report process here, trying to grapple with the question of effects associated with these projects, is difficult in the context of being separated from the question with which these processes are usually concerned. Can nature be exploited for human gain, having regard to environmental impacts? We're trying to look at these more nuanced questions of a project conceived to deliver ecological benefits based upon fundamentally the idea that allowing naturally is a good thing. And we have to proceed on the basis that attending that is the risk that Dr. King identifies in particular associated with potential tree loss. But we also have to proceed on the basis that, one, adaptive management and operational decision-making will be relevant, including to those questions of tree loss if relevant, but also that the alignment or better alignment of inundation at up to 7.8 events in 10 years as compared with the current 3.7 will also bring with it the balance of other benefits, in the sense that aquatic fauna and terrestrial fauna are anticipated to benefit in ways that will be independent of the potential risk associated with the 7.8 as compared with 7 in 10 exceedance. So the answers are: 1, if the risk was realised, it would not be a bad thing, because it would be returning or restoring the floodplain to environmental, more environmentally natural conditions. 2, we must have regard to the reality of any future operation of the project should it be approved, as one informed by adaptive management principles. And 3, in the context of the overall balancing exercise, we must have regard to all of the benefits that come along with better alignment of inundation, not just the question of potential risk. Ultimately, we come back to the, ultimately in terms of this question of, well, do we still achieve a benefit in circumstances where Fruit and Pappas say we should be all right now, or Fruit and Pappas say if you order that much, it might be a bit too much. Ultimately comes back in my submission, or we will ultimately rely upon the evidence of Dr. King to the effect that there remains a project need in all the circumstances in respect of the condition of the vegetation on the floodplain now, which is reflective of the fact that it's not getting what it should be getting. And 2, that there would be benefit associated with the project operating even in accordance with the watering objectives and scenarios, notwithstanding that 7.8 over 7 in 10 exceedance.
Okay. Last question from me. It's a sort of fairly open question. We haven't had a lot of discussion of the expert elicitation report through the course of this roundtable. You did touch on it a couple of times in presenting your submission today. But I'm gathering, but giving you a last opportunity to correct me if I'm wrong in this assumption, that there's no particular parts of that expert elicitation report that you wanted to draw to our attention in the context of the Burra Creek project.
The answer to that's no, on the basis that we've said what we need to say about the expert elicitation report previously, and particularly in the main place really is in that attachment to the Part C submission for ES Central.
Yeah. Okay.
I observed, I think, in passing today that fundamentally the ranges that it arrives at for relevant EVCs, insofar as they are relevant to Burra Creek, are generally within the fruit and pappus range. And so to the extent I've been speaking about fruit and pappus parameters, we could say the same things about the expert elicitation process.
Okay, that was it from me, but I'm going to hand over to Member Brisker.
Yeah, I'll just have a couple of questions. The first one is just in relation to the point you made about the timing of the inundation events. That's something that I haven't seen information on. Do you have evidence that the timing would be different or misaligned in the existing situation, or is it misaligned compared to the pre-existing? And what opportunities would the project have, given it's got to work with the flows that it receives and the environmental water receives to actually realign?
Yeah, there is. I don't have it to hand right now. I'm sorry, Member Brisker, because it's almost been consigned. Well, it's been consigned way back in my brain by now. So I apologise. I'll see if I can recall it by the time I finish. There is discussion with which I think you will be familiar with in the context of the surface water specialist assessment of the manner in which regulation has affected the typical flow patterns of the river in more general terms, and that is in effect to generally flatten out the flow patterns and to avoid the typical natural pulses which would occur. In that context, that remains, salient in the context of the Burra Creek floodplain, in the sense that that's now the typical flow pattern of the Murray River. It's a much flatter profile across the year, and it's one which doesn't provide for the historical pulsing, the seasonal variation which was historically experienced. What I'm going to share on screen now is from the Part A submission from ES Central, because it can, I suppose, illustrate the example that I'm giving in a more general sense. So this is particularly salient, of course, when we're talking about events happening up to or more than one time a year, and what the figure on the screen shows. I'm trying to blow it up to be big enough to read the legend, but you still may not be able to. The flow of the rivers has been fundamentally brought down. This is Victoria-wide proposition, basically regulated rivers across Victoria, as given in an example from the Victorian Environmental Water Holder, is you'll see there's a dotted line on the graph which indicates the natural variability of flow, including particularly the spring and autumn pulses or flows, the higher flows in those times of year. You probably cannot see, or can only see it with great difficulty, some variation throughout summer as well, including at least a period of base flow. What the graph indicates is the extent of regulation. Let's ignore for the moment the green water, or the green part of the graph, because the rest of it shows the unregulated flows which peak over winter. Then in orange, system operating water, which is the base flow maintained over what would otherwise be the drier periods caused by the take of water for irrigation and retention of water in storages. And then the blue consumptive water, which is what's released from storages for the purposes of consumptive uses. What the graph then shows is the green as the Victorian Environmental Water Holders' efforts to release water to mimic natural flows, particularly for the spring and autumn peaks. And so these questions of timing aren't questions which are established in the context of the specialist assessment as Well, at Burra Creek, there's a particular problem in the sense that we haven't had an autumn flow in X years, and we're going to start putting through autumn flows. Rather, it's a matter of flexibility and the ability to respond to existing flow patterns in the river and otherwise experienced on the floodplain, in the sense of, we've heard about the benefits and disbenefits of inundation at particular times for particular species and particular threats. And it's that flexibility of timing to which I was referring. Now, there is there's the underpinning your question, involved in your question, is the question of how the project relates to flow levels in the Murray River. And of course, primarily and preferably, it will operate by piggybacking on natural flows, such that, well, of course, inundation could be retained on the floodplain, or if necessary, and if available, pumping could proceed in circumstances where flows in the river are higher. But it's also the case that, given the structure of the environmental watering framework, there's the potential for environmental water to be available in the river, even in periods of comparatively lower flow, such that it shouldn't be perceived that pumping could only occur in periods of particularly high flow in the river. And that's how that flexibility, say you're in autumn and flows are low, there's not a higher, the higher releases through summer have come to an end, and you're in the comparatively lower period of flow in autumn. Environmental water might be released down the river for other purposes, and you might be able to piggyback on that for pumping. Or you might be able to take environmental water at a different time, when the amount of environmental water in the river is lower, but is made available through the decision-making processes to the project.
And so just to clarify, so currently at the moment, there then hasn't been an analysis in a specialist assessment that demonstrates that there's an issue with the timing of overbank events, because as I understand that the flow regime has been subdued by the peak flows being suppressed by the storage of water and so forth through the system, and then the water being delivered down the river. And one of the issues that we had submissions on today was, I guess, the constraints on operation mean that there's minimal, if any, overbank inundation associated with those water deliveries, which would suggest whatever flood events would occur, or overbank inundation events would occur, they'd be aligned with when they would happen anyway, in terms of being the larger pulses of water moving down the river, rather than the irrigation delivery flows, which under current arrangements aren't intended to cause overbank flooding. So I'm just wondering if there's a problem there that needs to be solved in terms of a misalignment of timing, or whether your comments about timing more in terms of just being able to avail the operators of the project being able in the future to avail themselves of flexibility, rather than having a timing problem that currently exists that they'd be solving with this project.
So the issue of timing and the manner in which my previous answer was really focused on timing as being an aspect in the future planning process and future environmental water decision making, as distinct from trying to identify a timing issue, in the sense that the project might somehow be involved in either stopping flows at times or somehow altering the flow regime in the river, or relating to when inundation now occurs. I'm not aware, but I'll keep my eyes again for instructions. I'm not aware that there is a particular assessment of the timing of overbank flows at present, which indicates that there's some particular issue to do with it. Rather, my understanding is, insofar as timing is identified as an issue, it's identified as an issue which relates to, I'll take a step back. The issue really is the questions of frequency and duration of flooding. The question of timing is something identified as being, I suppose, lost in the sense of inundation not being as frequent or extending for as long as it ought or naturally did, and timing really being a question of when new flows would be introduced as a consequence of the project. I think, as I understand it, the question of timing comes down to preferred timing of events that the project would cause, or the preferred operation of the project, and that's described in table 13.5 or 13-5 of the specialist assessment, in terms of generally giving spring timing as preferred, subject to the various considerations that it discusses. And insofar as the alterations to flow patterns are identified, that's a general proposition which is identified that that's related to frequency in that sense. The difficulty, I suppose, I'm grappling with in my mind about the question is, in the context of propositions around the constraints management strategy and so on, other alternatives to the project, without wishing to embark on submissions that I've made and we've made in respect to those matters in the past, and having regard to the scope of the committee. What the project provides is this operational flexibility for the floodplains to which these projects relate, without the need to inundate private land in particular, without the need to otherwise influence more major in-stream flow events in a way which might have either those sort of inundation consequences, or which otherwise might interfere with the manner in which water in the river is currently managed by the river operator, having regard to the timing throughout the year of the release of water for various purposes that graph indicates.
Thanks for that. And I just have one more question. It's just a point of clarification in paragraph footnote 12. So I think it's paragraph 12, footnote 12. And
Yes.
It's just a cross-reference. I just wanted to make sure that I was, in that cross-reference, I was following the right trail of logic. So it just says as addressed below, and I wasn't quite sure which section below to look at.
Thank you. I perhaps didn't come back and give you a paragraph cross-reference there. Thanks for inviting me to do so. The footnote really is addressing questions of what evidence the committee has before it of the condition of the floodplain, or the condition of communities and species at the floodplain. And so it can be taken as a cross-reference to paragraphs 18 to 21.
Thank you. That was my last question.
Thank you, Member Briscoe.
Thank you.
Sorry, unmute. That brings us to an end to the roundtable for the Burra Creek project. So that means we won't accept any more information unless it's specifically requested by the committee. That only happens very rarely, and it might happen if, for instance, in the course of writing up our report, we feel we need some clarification of something. If that were to occur, we would ensure that a process was put in place that allowed all parties to participate in whatever further information was requested. Our terms of reference require us to report within 30 business days to the Minister for Planning, and clause 47 of the terms of reference address what our report must contain. So that's the next step. The Minister will then release the report at her discretion. It generally happens when a decision is made, and it's released concurrently with the Minister's assessment in relation to the particular project. So the last thing that I wanted to do today was to thank all of the parties for their participation across the course of the last couple of weeks. And it is a little more difficult to have these kind of roundtable discussions in an online forum, but we were where we were with that due to the deferral and the availability constraints that we were working with. So I just want to thank everyone for their participation online, and you've given us all plenty to think about. So thanks again. And I was going to say we'll see you next time, but that there may not be next time. So thanks for your participation.